Anyway, so eventually, well, anyway, we had this session rose out of some chats over the last couple of days. There's one point that's come up several times in presentations and discussions, but hasn't been a big theme in these these semi-formal sessions we've had in the mornings, is how we could arrange knowledge transfer to government. So in this session, there are 5 willing volunteers, including myself, who are going to give some brief reflections on our experiences of working with government, and then we'll have some discussion on what might be done within this NERC-supported research agenda and projects within it, or maybe coordinating networks, whatever, that can help support knowledge transfer to government. So I suggest I go last of the 5 to segue into the discussion. Do I have a volunteer for? Okay, very well done, Stan. I'm sure the other 3 are very grateful.
No, I like to get these things over with.
Okay.
But I do want to just show a couple of slides. Can I do that?
Indeed, I think so. And I suggest we use the mic.
Well, in my case,
recording and people hearing.
that would be helpful. Brilliant, thank you. Either of those. Great, thanks. Is that going to? Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Okay, for those of you who weren't here a couple of weeks ago when people introduced themselves, I'm Stan Zachary. I'm retired, mostly retired, statistician, mathematician, attached to the, loosely to Heriot Watt and the University of Edinburgh. And I'm down here quite a lot too, because my particular interest these days is in energy systems. We had a long program on that the first 4 months of this year. In recent years, I've been doing some practical work along with Chris and Amy Wilson at Edinburgh on advising, well, in helping National Grid in particular provide the right advice to government on the amount of electricity capacity it's necessary to procure to see us through successive winters. This is an annual review process of the state within the country of our supplies, and it's necessary to plan how much we need about 4 years in the future in order to introduce a capacity market to procure the amount of capacity, that's the amount of generation that we need. So it's an exercise, mainly statistical exercise, in looking a few years into the future, trying to decide how much electricity we're going to need, then making decisions how much capacity should be procured on the basis of that. Now, the interesting thing here from a scientific point of view is that we don't know what's going to happen in the future, of course. It's very uncertain in all sorts of ways. There are uncertainties about demand, there's uncertainties about what generation will be there in any case, there are uncertainties about the severity of the winter, which is a major determinant of how much capacity we need. All these uncertainties have got to be taken into account. But some of these are probabilistically difficult to quantify. In particular, there are decisions that will be made elsewhere, but typically within government, about how fast we're going to green our electricity system, about how fast we are going to attempt to reduce demand in various ways, but at the same time how fast we're going to attempt to decarbonize, because if we decarbonize, then we will need a lot more electricity. If we, for example, decarbonizing means shifting a lot of domestic heating, replacing gas boilers, for example, by heat pumps, which will be electrically driven but will be much more efficient. The carbon emissions hopefully will be a lot less than they are at present. So what happens is that National Grid define a number of scenarios for the future. And they have some core scenarios which are here. Now this doesn't, somehow a slide doesn't include the entire legend along the bottom, but one scenario is what happens if we go green, which is there. They've got something called consumer power. They have a scenario that is produced by DEC. This is figure is taken from the 2015 electricity capacity report, which is sort of three and 4 years ago now. So at that time the relevant government department was DEC rather than BEIS. DEC was less confusing. This is another sort of deviation from a scenario in which the winter is going to be cold. They have about 5 core scenarios, and they have a number of additional ones, and they try and look at what happens under each of those scenarios. And they look at the amount of capacity that they might procure in gigawatts, and they work out some economic cost. And the economic cost, if you don't procure enough capacity, there are risks of blackout, which have a substantial economic cost, and as you reduce the capacity, the risk of blackout increases. We're talking about very small probabilities, so the tail is an exponential tail, so we're looking at an exponential tail, and it's exponential, of course. As you increase your capacity, the risk goes exponentially to 0. And then if you buy too much capacity, well, the risk has gone to 0, but there's a linear increase in the cost of providing that capacity. So if they knew what was going to happen in the future, suppose we knew it was going to be the gone green scenario, we would take the minimum point on that green curve, and we would say we are going to purchase about 47.5 gigawatts of capacity, and so that goes to the capacity market. The costs are quite substantial. These are costs on the vertical axis in millions of pounds. So there's a certain amount of money involved here. They have to get things right. Now, this is when the difficulties arise. We don't know which scenario is going to happen in the future. We can find lots of scenarios. 5 core scenarios shown here, and 2 more extreme scenarios shown by the dotted lines. In particular, this one, the blue dotted line, dashed line, corresponding to a very cold winter. But a lot of these scenarios depend which comes to pass. Depends on things that are difficult to probabilistically quantify, not just because they are, in terms of future uncertainty, but because some of them depend on decisions that government themselves will make, such as how fast we're going to go green. If National Grid, for example, is writing a report, the electricity capacity report, in which they are providing advice to government about how much capacity is to be procured, they do not wish in their report to say, we reckon that there is a probability of 0.1 that you are actually going to carry out your promises to green the system. You might talk about the probability it's going to be a cold winter. That's less controversial. And there are a whole lot of players in the industry who are providing capacity, who are scrutinizing these reports and say, well, we don't agree with the probabilities you've assigned to things, and if you reckoned that there's going to be a higher probability of something happening, then you should be procuring more capacity. Nobody wishes to assign probabilities, some for reasons which are not particularly honourable, they just don't want to put their neck on the line, and some which are perfectly reasonable. You're not supposed to, in providing advice to government, second guess higher level government decision making. So what do? They say, we cannot be any rational scientist, I mean this argument is over, would be a Bayesian and take probabilities of these scenarios and integrate over to get an expected cost, and take the minimizing point, assuming that at least that your utility function is linear in the costs. But we can't be respectable Bayesian. What they do is use something called least worst regret analysis. The first thing they do is take each of these scenarios and they shift the costs vertically so the minimum cost is 0. That is to say, they define a regret function, which at each capacity to procure for this scenario is the cost less the minimum cost that you would incur if you made precisely the right decision for that scenario. So here are, if I can persuade my computer to do the right thing, here are the regret functions. They're just the same thing as before, except that we've pulled them all down so that their minimum value is 0. And then they say we look at each possible decision. Say we decide to procure 50 gigawatts, and we say what is the worst cost that we could incur in terms of the regret meaning cost less the best you could have achieved if that scenario came to pass. So they take, for each capacity to procure, they take the maximum regret, the worst regret, and then they take the capacity to procure which minimizes that worst regret. And that is their recommendation. So here it is about 47.8, which is about what they recommended in the 2015 electricity capacity report. I guess I should have updated this slightly, but anyhow. And the industry is very happy, and the relevant government department is very happy. Ofgem are reasonably happy, and therefore, since National Grid's job is just to do the work, they're very happy. They say we've got this entirely objective analysis that doesn't assign probabilities. It gives us the right answer without our having to do that. Well, the fact is that in doing their analysis, really, before we got involved, go back to the cost functions, the analysts nor government or anybody else ever didn't actually plot these regret functions. What they plotted was these cost functions and said, now we do this least worst regret analysis and we get out an answer. But if you do this, and you do calculate these regret functions, and please, why does my computer refuse to move? You will see that the least worst regret solution is defined just by two scenarios. In an obvious sense, the two scenarios that are plotted according to those dashed lines. And they were extreme scenarios. They were scenarios plus sensitivities. They were things that they didn't think was likely to happen. So they populate their scenario space with a largish number of scenarios, the ones I've shown and quite a few more. And the answer they get is determined by the two most extreme situations that they think could happen, the most optimistic and the most pessimistic. And that's all there is to it. So is it really that objective? What happens, and I will tell you, but don't anybody quote me, even though bits of this may be available online. The analysts at National Grid or wherever discussing this choose a range of scenarios, and we populate the scenario space and we say, well, we'll have to have some rather extreme scenarios because they're possibilities. And they look at the most extreme scenarios, and they now know to draw this picture, and they look at the answer they're going to get, and they say, that answer seems reasonable because it's reasonably compatible with the things that are actually more likely to happen. So there's nothing really objective about it. Instead of saying how likely scenarios might be in the future, which they do not like to do, they take a collection of scenarios and they're either in or they're out. And nobody notices the ones that are out. And then the ones that are in, you take the two most extreme and you go roughly halfway between them. That's all their decision making amounts to. And anyway, the Secretary of State for Energy takes this figure and says, well, we have to procure that much, but let's set aside 2 or 3 gigawatts that we'll obtain closer to real time, because we can always obtain a bit extra close to real time when we're more exactly aware of what might happen. And that's an offline decision on the part of the Secretary of State. He or she, their rationale for that is not at all clear. So there's a certain amount of fuzz. So it doesn't really matter what you recommend within this sort of region, but it would matter if you get totally ridiculous answers if you took sufficiently extreme scenarios, which nevertheless could happen. So what am I trying to say? There's no getting away from the fact that the probabilities matter. They don't put in things that are very unlikely to happen, and that is scientifically rational in decision making, although you have to worry about things that could happen that would have extremely negative consequences if they did. But government, so the probabilities matter. There's no getting away from the fact that probabilities matter. I mean, you just can't do anything in any scientific or half scientific approach to decision making. But government don't like it because those probabilities are up to challenge by other people from within government, by the industry, by the public, and nobody really wishes to take the responsibilities. And anyway, if you say that something will happen with probability 0.2, then in due course it will either not have happened or it will have happened. The probabilities will go to 0 or 1 at a certain point in time, so your original estimate will inevitably be wrong. Because people don't realize that probability is your state of knowledge at the time. So I think that these are the difficulties. Now, just to push it slightly further, I don't mean to overrun, the question is how then do you communicate information to government? I think that the right information is essentially that picture. Then the decision makers who are not innumerate can assign their own probabilities and say what they think is likely. And I think that that's rational. And I think that the correct thing to do with government, in particular, from the point of view of the analysts, is not to go and do things like putting in all the probabilities, because it's not the job of the analyst to do that. It's a question of how to present information. And it's quite possible in a simple example such as this to present the information in such a way that the decision maker can themselves view the consequences of their decision. Their decision is the point on the horizontal axis. I'll come back in a second. And the consequences of the decision, it's quite rational, these regret functions, when you think about it. Even in a Bayesian context, it turns out that the correct thing to consider, or it's equally good in a Bayesian context to consider the regret functions. You're minimizing, you can sum of pi f of xi, where xi is your decision. You can subtract a constant from any function f, and it doesn't change your objective function. That's the right picture. It communicates the information you need. I think what we have to do with government is to is not to provide an answer in terms of a single number, but not to present all the input data either and say, what do you think? Because that's what the analyst has got to interpret. What we've got to try and do is to present the right information, that summarises the possible actions available and the possible consequences of those actions. Okay, I'm sorry to overrun a little bit, but that's my little polemic on that.
Should we go in order of proximity to me? Paula, does that sound like a good idea?
Yeah, fine. Get my nose. Great, thanks. No slides. Right, okay, so I have no slides. And the good thing about going second is that I had a chance to scribble down some notes on what I might say. So it's going to probably be quite different from Stan, because I guess my experience is more on the importance of the process of stakeholder engagement, because how that affects the outcomes. So this is probably experience from several projects, and I'll try and put it in context as I go through. But I guess the main point is that government is one stakeholder. There are many other stakeholders, and it depends on your problem, and you need to have them all represented in the room, depending on what that problem is. And you need to have them involved in any project right from the start. There's no point bringing them in halfway through or at the end, because by that time you've already done the work. And usually who the stakeholders you're engaging with will often have a massive effect on the work that you do and the outcome of the project. So what we often end up doing in most of our projects is there is a whole start of the project where you might do stakeholder interviews to actually find out what is the decision where they need help with. That might be different depending on the stakeholders. So even before you go to those interviews or stakeholder workshops, you need to do a stakeholder mapping exercise, so you know this is the ultimate goal or the aim that you got your funding for. You have to work out who are the stakeholders that are relevant, that you need to engage in to both understand the problem and the context of that problem, and who would eventually try and take up and have buy-in to your outcomes. So we would probably go through a process of actually understanding what are the different levels of governance, so from national scale, international scale, right down to local authorities. What are the sectors that need to be represented in the room, which in landscapes is huge. So you need to have representatives from agricultural forestry, from water, from urban environments, from city landscapes, and they all need to be there in the room depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. And you need to have not just government, you need to have sort of the business, the civil society and the NGOs all in there as well. So actually that is usually then an issue of project resources, because actually if you try and have all these people in the room, you're limited actually in what you can do, because you have to at least pay their travel to come, even if you can't afford to pay for their time. And these are very busy stakeholders who often suffer from stakeholder fatigue from all of the many projects are trying to get them into a workshop to ask them to have buy-in to their outcomes. So assuming you get through that process of identifying the right stakeholders and you get them in the room, then you've really got to put a lot of effort into how you design that interaction process. And from our experience, you really need to think about including professional facilitators in that process, because it's something that scientists are not very good at doing. So we know our models, our scenarios, and the facilitator acts as that interaction person to make sure we get out of all of those interactions exactly what we need to either parameterize our models or run our models. A lot of my experience has come from participatory scenario development. So the scenarios we develop come from the stakeholders themselves. So we start off from first principles of what are the drivers that affect your decisions. You might cluster them. You might then start to look at how they are represented in your models. So there is a phase of where they build up the scenario you want to look at, and then you would model their specific scenario. And the same analogy works in terms of you can develop scenarios in a participatory, models in a participatory setting, or model interfaces in a participatory setting. And all of that helps you get the buy-in. And the more you iterate, i.e. if you only have one stakeholder meeting at the beginning with no intermediate follow-up and other stakeholder meetings, you will lose that buy-in. It has to happen regularly throughout the whole of the project. And then hopefully if their stakeholders start to see their scenarios, their drivers, their parameters represented in your model, they will already be brought into the responses that come out. I think then it's some of the lessons we've learned from that process is the smaller the scale you do that on, the easier it is to get buy-in to the stakeholders and have an outcome on the decision. So if you're doing it in a local authority, a city region, that's much easier than doing it for the whole of Europe, because it's very difficult to get the stakeholders to interact. The stakeholders usually get as much out of the process as the science policy interface, because they're learning from talking to each other. And what they normally decide they want from your modelling tool at the end then is something that helps that discussion process, so something that's exploratory, not something that will give you a final answer that this is the best solution. So I think that's a learning process on both sides, in that it's them understanding the system complexities and a tool that will show them both the unintended as well as the intended consequences of any of their decisions, as well as understanding from sciences what those decisions are that we need to be informed about. One quick example, which I will have to be careful what I'm saying if this is being recorded. So we're currently working with Welsh Government to develop a modelling tool to look at their agricultural policy after the Common Agricultural Policy, which might now realistically be the 31st of October, but who knows. So we're developing a modelling tool with them whilst the policy itself is evolving. So normally, ideally, at the beginning, you would know what is the policy that you're trying to give informed support for. So you can look at, actually, okay, this is the modelling framework we've got, this is the inputs and this is the outputs. In this case, we can't necessarily do that, and it requires a certain amount of flexibility on both sides, because the policy itself is still evolving and going out for consultation with farmers and the general public. So that is another added challenge, and part of that is, again, also managing expectations that models are not the truth, models can't deliver everything, understanding there are a lot of assumptions within our modelling framework, being transparent, as transparent as we can about those assumptions, and getting sign-off on those assumptions. So you co-create the assumptions in your model. You don't just, as the scientists, say this is all we can do, these are our assumptions, but you have to try and get the stakeholders themselves or the policy level to say, okay, this is the assumption, and then you can look at the uncertainty around that assumption, because otherwise you just can't move forwards. And I think then the other major side of it is then knowing how your modelling tool is going to be used at the end of your project and going forwards. And that usually means you're putting some kind of interface on it, and that interface has to communicate the outputs in a way that is useful for them, but also not hide the assumptions and the uncertainty behind those. And there is no real easy answer to how that happens, other than iterating it with them through lots of prototypes that allow you to keep doing QA on the system, but also allow them to tell you exactly what they want gradually over the course of the project, and not just at the end, because you won't get it right if you leave it to the end. So that's probably most of what I would say about the experience of developing scenario modelling tools with stakeholders. The only other quick point I'd make is, if people are really keen to make an impact in policy terms, is to really get involved in the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform. So probably most of you know IPCC, but IPBES, I don't know if many people know that. Well, that's the equivalent for biodiversity and ecosystem services. But just getting involved in that, because the policy community across 200 governments have put years and years of effort of getting this platform off the ground, because they want the science evidence behind the targets they're creating. And actually, once you're involved in that process, you get asked continually to come and present. So I presented to the European Council, I was at DEFRA on Tuesday presenting the results of it, and they're using it to develop the next global biodiversity set of targets for 2020. And that's one way of ensuring your scientific evidence is there, and you're seen as an independent set of evidence that can help lead to achievable targets that actually might make a difference in the future, that compared to the past, when, as we're going to fail most of our biodiversity targets in 2020, we need to change the system, and it brings the awareness of the drivers that need to be changed to meet those policy goals. So I'll leave it there.
When Peter sends his next daily email around, would it be possible just to have in that a link to this the intergovernmental platform?
Yep.
Sounds like something that
Yep.
look at. Great, thanks. So actually, I realised, Simon, did I actually ask you yesterday?
Sort of, yeah.
Did you think I'd ask you?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Do you want me to go now?
Yes, please. If
Cool. Okay. So, I think in my usual blunt way, I come at this very differently, and probably.
Put the mic on.
Oh, that's always dangerous. Yeah. Yeah. So I come at this probably quite bluntly and probably far too honestly. And probably with a little bit of a different perspective, because a lot of my work is abroad. So whenever I go to influencing policy meetings, it's all about UK government. And actually, there are some other countries out there which are great. And I'm just going to kind of give you what I would call impact light in, less developed countries. Firstly, you have a massive advantage. Policymakers in developing countries are much more accessible. It's all about who you know. So on one of my projects in Cambodia, as a project partner, because politicians do not get paid a lot there, so he also works at the university, he is the Deputy Secretary of State. If you can make that pathway to impact really short, you can. Your other advantage, as like a fairly rich Western scientist, if you stay in nice places, you tend to bump into them. Like, we have a PhD student right now, and one of the supervisors has just gone to talk to the ambassador who lives next door to help grease some wheels and things like that. See, you can't do this in the UK, but it's much harder to do in the UK, but it's relatively easy to do in developing nations. And so that actually, you wouldn't think, oh, I can just go and speak to the ambassador, but actually, sometimes you can. Especially even here in London, you can go and talk to their ambassador, who will put you in touch with the in-country ambassador and things like that. So often it's just because people don't try. Another thing that you may think, and it makes you feel a bit dirty, nice meals and wine really does help. We ran a policymaker event at one of the ESP conferences, and it was like a side event, and we paid for some policymakers to come. We were like, look, you come and we'll pay for the hotel and the flights, and there'll be a session, and then there'll be some wine and food and all that. And that was relatively cheap, and the session was so popular that the other sessions complained about us. Because we had policymakers in the room, and the way we got them in the room was basically making it easy for them and providing nice food. So that's one angle. It can be easy and think. The other angle that I'm going to say basically is no one really cares about the science you do as much as you do, so stop trying to force them to listen to it. Yeah? We live in like a Me Too era now. Consent is a thing. You can't just ram information down their throat. No one likes it. If you're dealing with a policymaker, 90% of the time, you should be listening. You should be just talking to them. You might give a brief introduction of the project. They don't care about the intricacies of a model on the whole. What they do actually come to a meeting with, in their head, is a few questions. So if you can start any interaction with, okay, this is a project, we're vaguely working in water. What are your big needs right now? And they'll give you a list of 5 things instantly. And you'll be like, okay, well, in your head you'll be thinking, well, none of them are exactly what the project is answering, but we can kind of answer question 4. If you can kind of answer question 4, just turn around and say, okay, in like 6 months, a year, we will have some answers for you on question 4. And that is how you start that engagement, because then you've provided something that they actually wanted, rather than done something you wanted and tried to make them listen to it. And the former is way more successful. And that I'll leave like that.
I'm somewhat impressed that Simon was claiming to be blunt when Gavin is up next.
Well, I shouldn't need to be too blunt, because usually I spend my professional life criticising other people's work as a meta-analyst. But on this one, on policy interaction, I can reflect on my research and criticise myself, because I've never got this right. It always seems to go wrong for some reason or another. So early on in meta-analysis, I did a thing on marine protected areas, and it was intended to inform policy, and it was a big global meta-analysis of whether marine protected areas work. And I was kind of halfway through it, and I started figuring out this is pretty much useless to the policy world, because all I'm saying is, are there more fish outside a marine protected area or inside a marine protected area? And given that we put marine protected areas in nice places where there are lots of fish, the answer to that question should be patently obvious before you even start crunching any data. Okay, so fine, I'm going to get a nice paper out of this and all the rest of it, but in terms of the policy questions about where do you put marine protected areas, how many of them should you have marine protected areas, or should you use fishing quotas, they're the questions, they're the policy questions. So I had the wrong comparators, straight away I had the wrong comparators, and so that work was never going to influence policy. In my defence, I was a postdoc at the time, so it's my PI's problem. But I was constantly in that situation where I'm doing this work to inform policy, and there's a fundamental issue that you just need to think for 5 minutes, not even 5 minutes, to figure out this isn't actually going to inform policy. So sometimes we get the science completely wrong, I think, when we're talking about it being policy relevant. The other interaction is sometimes the policymakers really mess you around as well. And sometimes the policymakers have got absolutely no clue what they want at all. And I've experienced this not just in ecology, but in medicine, in medical calls as well. You see it in the grant calls. Here's the grant. No, that isn't what you want. So the call itself, you look at the call, you analyse it, and you go, that is not going to do what you think it's going to do. And there's no mechanism for telling them that. There's no way to say, come on guys, let's sort this out. So there's something about how we shape our calls sometimes, and the lead time. Even in this programme, when we started getting down to the nuts and bolts of it, we were saying, what's our question that we're focusing on? Is this about net zero carbon? Is this about rewilding? What's the focus of this? Because we want to make the models that we use, this is complex, hard science, linking all of these big, complicated models. So we want to make it answer as many questions as it can, but we're still starting with the models, not with the question. If we start with the models and not the question, then which of the uncertainties do we propagate and why? And we have that massive intractable complexity. Whereas if we start from the decision problem and work back up the way, now at least we can figure out these uncertainties are really going to matter. We're going to need to propagate them fully. We're going to need to think about that really in a really detailed, sensible way. These uncertainties over here, well, that might be an interesting academic debate, but it probably doesn't actually impinge on our decision very much. So doing some kind of quick and dirty value of information right at the beginning of a project, I'd argue even before a call comes out, maybe that should be the kind of work that we're engaged on to design the call. So I think there's something wrong about how we're doing this reactive grant cycle thing. There's a structural thing that we could do better. And I think the other thing is, I thought the first talk was great. Talking about eliciting probabilities or generating probabilities from the data, the whole Bayesian framework. But we need to have some more engagement with the policy world on this stuff. We have all of our policy research fellows going and embedding and following the policy makers around to learn about policy making and policy needs. But there's no mechanism for them to actually learn about this stuff in detail. And it's been incredibly valuable for me, even just dipping in for the last couple of days. We're learning about each other and each other's models, but they know nothing about any of it at all. So what mechanism can we develop to kind of try and actually get much closer alignment of policy practice? And then the last thing I would say is that we've got this obsession with novelty. And in all our grants we're going for, this is novel, this is fantastic, this is new, we're doing that whole overselling thing, and then you feel bad when you don't deliver. But we overset, we don't say, this is the bit of information, the extra bit of information, the extra incremental bit of information that you need that will really improve your decision. And we really need to get over that so that we get away from this kind of, is it useful to the world? Well, it's about birds and there's someone from RSPB on the panel, so yes, it's useful. Is it excellent science? Well, yeah, it's building on what's gone before and it's taking it in a new way. Tick, it's excellent science. I really think we need to move away from that model of operating our grant panels to think about what is the value of this information in the context of the decisions that are being made. And I think that will be the end of my rant, because some of you guys know a lot more about this than I do. Yeah.
Okay, so I'd just like to talk about a couple of experiences of or a couple of issues in knowledge transfer. Both of these are, to some extent, following on from things Gavin has just said about how we do knowledge transfer, starting from current skills and practices in government. And one issue is that many techniques which we've been talking about in this programming, I'm not so expert on myself, but are very important in projects that I'm involved in, emulation and expert elicitation. And these are typically these are commonly not taught in statistics MSc programs, but they are of very great practical importance in everything we've been talking about. And again, I think it was Gavin who first raised in the first workshop this point about how doing more research will have limited impact if we can't work out how to take existing research into practice. I mean that was again something he touched on a bit just now. So the first of these 2 points is the need to provide methods in a way that in which they can be used more widely. Apart from anything else, there is limited specialist capacity in academia. So if we can parcel things up in a way where people can help themselves instead of having to call in a crack squad of Bayesian statisticians, whatever, to help them, then that helps. That simply means more can be done, and that the really ultra specialist expertise can be focused more where it is absolutely needed. And going a little bit idealistic, this might be ideas like that might be linked to discussions with governments on training, recruitment and development, such as the data science partnership. That's one area where this is, as I understand it, the government data science partnership, which I think is the right name, is still somewhat under development. So that could be that could be a very significant thing in helping spread different methodological expertise across government. And just again going back to what Gavin said about what the criteria applied by research councils are. So I lead a project at the Alan Turing Institute called Managing Uncertainty in Government Modelling, and the theme of that project is absolutely explicitly to parcel parcel up some of these approaches, some of the things we're talking about in this this programme at the Newton Institute largely, in such a way that a wider range of people in government can use them. And I mean, part of the, I mean, I was directly quoting the case for support, where I'm saying that this is working out how to help people help themselves is a greater challenge and a research topic in its own right compared to actually us working out how to do it in a university. But I think one of the reasons we were able to do that was that this was an internal Turing Institute call, and so it was positioned a little bit differently in compared to Research Council proposal, and we knew that that kind of message was one that the Turing Institute process would love, but we'd have been a bit nervous about making it in a responsive mode EPSRC call. The second point I'd like to mention is mechanisms for supporting innovation work with government, or to put it more crudely, money. So there are mechanisms to do things in the next year, which basically, because that's government's day job, and there are important things we can contribute in consecutive annual cycles. I mean, we've done, with referring back to what Stan Zachary was speaking about first, this is something we've essentially done in that mode, and I mean, we'd like to think this has been somewhat beneficial. There's obviously also mechanisms for developing things which will come into widespread practice maybe in 5 to 10 years. That's research councils. But in the middle, looking at things that maybe come into looking at say taking current research into something that may be in practice in 2 to 4 years. There's a shortage of widely accessible, and by that I simply mean across different government departments, schemes to do that kind of thing. I mean, the main mechanism for that sort of innovation timescale work is, has anyone heard of Small Business Research Initiative or GovTech? Yeah, so this is basically, it's a scheme to which government units at all levels, it can be government departments, can be local councils, can pitch ideas for innovation projects, and then GovTech selects these, it goes out to tender. But the difficulty there for universities is there are lots of things where universities have very, very relevant skills, and even more importantly where universities can do things which other people can't. But the GovTech scheme, basically a GovTech project requires too much money to be spent too quickly and starting too soon for that to map onto the way universities generally employ people. So in terms of the opportunities for collaboration with universities, the one general scheme there is implicitly largely excludes universities. It also can be very difficult to access budgets even for things like massively leveraged schemes such as leveraged PhDs. So typically there you'd be looking to have someone really good working on applied research for 3.5 years, and the direct contribution will be something like £25,000. So that'll be less than 10% of the total costs, including overheads of employing someone at that quality, that career level. So I think there is certainly appetite for innovation work. I mean, apart from the fact that analysts personally always want to do innovation work because they find it interesting. One notion I often put forward, and this is something that's never proved remotely controversial, is that you can't be in the best place for doing analysis in 4 years if you try and get there through consecutive 1-year incremental cycles. It's certainly a message that always goes down well, or people are receptive to the idea that if you want to be in the best place in 4 years' time, you need a more strategic approach and looking at a designed multi-year programme. But the trouble is that commonly there just is not a way of supporting that. Under the way things have gone recently. I mean, partly to an extent to which maybe there never quite was, because in central government, multi-year budgets are not always the way it works. I mean, partly there are issues, there are certainly issues of innovation work perhaps not being a ring-fenced activity, and if you have something that's not a ring-fenced activity sitting in a non-ring-fenced department, it's going to be reduced quite seriously. As I say, there seems to be appetite there, and people see value, but it's hard. There's a lack of mechanisms. This is in contrast with where you get Innovate UK mechanisms for working with private sector, which seem to map on pretty well to the way that companies think and to the way that universities hire people. There may be possibilities in the next government spending round. I mean, it looks like that was supposed to be going on in the second half of this calendar year. From what I've heard, it's likely to be delayed by a year because government has no capacity for anything other than Brexit. So budgets may just simply be rolled over. And dealing with that kind of matter that's the sort of matter which is way above my own pay grade to seriously influence. I mean, that's the kind of matter that the people like directors of Newton Institute and directors and Turing Institute and so on might discuss, and I know that some people are. So that's what I have to say, and so the question for discussion, I think, is within this agenda in evidence-based decision making for landscapes. What useful things are that we as individuals, universities, communities. There's I think is it Leicester who lead the coordinating projects? Yeah. What they might do, there are other related networks. For instance, one of the structures out of which this programme grew was the Models to Decisions network, and there will be other people. What is there that can usefully be done to help increase the impact in government practice of work within this programme, and particularly what is there that can help mean we have a really positive impact for good in government. It might be one thing it might be useful just to start off is if anyone has knowledge, because I have none, but if anyone has knowledge of what the Leicester-led project is currently planning in this space, if indeed those sorts of plans are public. If not, we can. I mean, they're clearly one of the one group to whom we need to feed back from the discussion like this.
Well, there is Heiko presented at the end of the opening workshop,
Yeah.
so his slides are the best.
Yeah.
That will tell you what they're currently funding and what they're planning
Yeah.
to still fund in wave one.
He will be here next week.
Very good.
Duncan will be here next week as well.
Yeah, so that's something we can. Is he here just for the workshop or?
Just for the work.
Okay, so
One day, I think I can just do the workshop.
yeah, so we should have a chat with him then.
In the context of the call, and this I haven't actually looked at detail, government are not the only landscape decision makers, and land managers, farmers, etc. are a very important group, but in a sense nobody in these preceding presentations have mentioned. And my experience of...
Actually, you can blame me for that because
that's fine.
of the question I asked.
My experience of working with farmers and trying to have impact in that area, some of the key issues is around sort of trust and legitimacy with your stakeholder audience. And those don't come from the quality of your model, the detail of your mathematics, your number of nature papers, or your funding. They tend to come, I think, from perhaps two particular areas. elements. One is longevity
Mm.
of actually having worked in a geographic area or with a particular community for long enough to have built a track record of trust. And that is certainly something that the funding models that we operate is very challenging. And the other thing is really about, in a way, empathy, which is partly a little bit about what you mentioned, about understanding their context, their problem, their constraints. And often modelers and mathematicians, and I'm going to be broadly generalizing here, are often not very good at that, because they're and I'll include myself broadly in there in some respects, are very good at simplifying the problem. And decision makers, land managers, do not have simple problems. So if you don't have that legitimacy of really understanding the space in which they're working, your messages are unlikely to have traction.
Yeah, that's certainly something. I mean, there's some things in that I think reflected in interactions that we've had in energy work. I guess one difference is that I've very rarely ended up dealing with organisations that are not, in some sense, sort of technical organisations that have some kind of electrical engineers or modellers within them. But certainly one other issue which I think is very directly relevant is in dealing with organisations of different sizes. You get different levels of specialist. You just don't get the same kind of specialist people in small organisations, which can make knowledge transfer in some ways more challenging, certainly different. That could even apply when you're dealing with quite large organisations. So I found it very different dealing with National Grid compared to dealing even with one of the larger local network operators, because you don't have, they're just smaller organisations. They don't have the same specialist analysts that you can deal with in a sense on the terms of the way we think internally.
Yeah, I think one of the things we perhaps really need to bear in mind is that this is one of the toughest scientific projects in terms of dealing with stakeholders and companies, because there can't be many scientific issues that affect so many people, and yet we're dealing with such insufficient knowledge. And I find it quite frightening. So, if the phone rings this morning and someone rings up and says, "Can you make a statement about how often what's going to happen this afternoon is going to happen on Tuesday? How often has that been, to what extent has that frequency been increased because CO2 is currently 400 parts a million?" Very difficult to give a definitive answer. It will depend on which model you look at. So I think when it comes to policymakers, I think we need to remember the point raised about, well, are there lots of policymakers and who are they? And who are the stakeholders? Who are they? Well, it could be our relatives that we're worried about this afternoon. Parents struggling with the heat, for instance. And I'm sure the land surface decision is intimately related to that. I mean, if we have this every summer, that must have a massive effect. We may want to use the land surface here. The very obvious thing that's got to come out of this meeting is, can the UK as an exemplar implement zero net emissions? It's this massive amount of uncertainty we have. There's probably amazing things go on in this room, process-based solutions of equations, where you make something and the uncertainty gets very low and off you go. You could be designing a rocket or whatever you're designing, but when it comes to the climate, we're in this unique position. Stakeholders want to know information, but there is just so much uncertainty. A tremendous amount of money has gone into climate research. I mean, it might not feel like it when you get constant rejections from NERC or only seemingly small amounts of money floating around, but in reality, there's a lot of money not in. We don't know, for instance, equilibrium climate sensitivity to it and a factor of 2. I mean, where have we gone wrong? I think the blunt talking, still here? No, gone. I think that's to be. I think that's a very good thing, and I think we need to have a conversation. We can't just keep. Are we for everlastingly going to be saying, send us the next check? We don't understand convection. We don't understand how the jet stream might move. We don't understand how losing the polar ice sheets will change the wind direction. We don't understand the positive feedbacks in the system. Imagine that's a dramatic output rate warming over land.
Yeah, and how yeah, well, yeah. So it's also sort of how you well, a related thing to how you do direct decision support in these circumstances, and how you communicate when you do have that uncertainty, how you can communicate what we actually the sort of glass half full ways, how you communicate what we do know.
Yes, quite.
So any other issues that people we should move on to the possible mechanisms that we could that could happen in this research agenda. But are there any other points people have on issues?
Yeah, say you have a big project and with loads of with loads of stakeholders, in-kind support, in-cash support. Let's keep it in kind for the moment, but quite a bit. How you keep your independence so that you can keep communicating honestly, while at the same time you want to be effective. So that's an enormous. There could be an enormous clash.
Because you're taking the risk that you could be wrong, but it's good to give information about a potential alarming situation. Okay, so you have to take the risk. You have to say something that this could go horribly wrong, and we're telling you the science may say this, but we don't know for sure. We're saying it's good to alert people, but we take the risk in 10 years' time someone might turn around and say, well, the summer rainfall intensity didn't grow by that percentage.
And Paula?
Yeah, I mean, it's only partly related, I guess, to that, but I think it's this is a sort of two-way interaction. So, and we have to be careful, I think, as scientists of not being. So part of it is not being too guarded, making sure we are seen as independent providers of evidence. We're not making the decision. We're providing information on which they can make the decision. And usually there is several possible decisions, and it's down to the decision maker to make that. So we are providing independent evidence, and the decision makers are really keen to have that evidence, even if there's lots of uncertainties associated with it and lots of assumptions, as long as they're clear on what those are. So I don't think we should be scared that we can't help or make a difference, and we shouldn't be starting these conversations. We just need to be very clear about the limitations of the evidence that we're giving them, and then it's up to the decision-making process to take that to the next step. We're not making, that's not the role of science to make those decisions. But I guess to me it is this two-way interaction, because we're educating ourselves to try and be more policy or decision relevant, but at the same time I think there's an education of the stakeholders themselves to actually understand the complexity of the system without overwhelming them. So we have had a history where a lot of decisions are made in silos, and we all know as scientists that's a really stupid thing to do. So, and they are moving away from that and recognising the importance of the system and potential unintended consequences. But I think that's part of the conversation, and I think that's why I worry a bit with the term optimisation, and that there is no best solution. But this is a long-term evolving conversation, and if we can give them tools to help that, but be very careful on how we frame that provision of tools, the provision of scientific evidence, then I think we should keep pushing forward with the evolution of where that goes and how we can help.
Yeah. Any other issues? Okay, sure. So we can move on to what what can be done to help it? I guess one piece of context here, and one thing we've run into thinking about a proposal for the current large grants call is the difficulty of doing of having the knowledge transfer side, which is pretty directly part of the requirements in the relatively short duration of the project. So we've actually ended up seeing if we can just right at the beginning add on something paid for from somewhere else to lengthen the project and do that side. And I think that well, it was again something that came up in one of the other talks about the general need for design of funded programs to be consistent with what the aims are in the context of how universities or research organisations work. And that's a sort of long-term issue, but that's one of the sort of the strategic issues that sometimes sits beneath these discussions. Is there any particular sort of requests people might make to the for want of a better word, to Leicester? Leicester saves the world. Any particular types of support or types of events? Are there any sort of brokerage activities where they can act as they or someone else might act as a kind of one-stop shop? Any help that people particularly wish for?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if this is something for Leicester or not, but I mean, it's what we struggled with in the scoping workshop for here, that it was in September, is you go in naively assuming that the stakeholders in the room know what questions that they want us to answer are, and it's been very clear during that process that we didn't get anything hugely useful out of it. And then we had the follow-up questionnaire, which was more useful with some interviews. But I think it's that whole initial scoping process is not one single workshop isn't enough, and that in its own right is quite difficult for us. And you get all the independent projects doing it separately, which is then leads to the stakeholder fatigue. If there is some kind of coordinated process that tries to help at least with the scoping exercise, because I think this is what Gavin was saying, that scoping exercise probably needs to happen before all the projects are funded, but the funding landscape doesn't really work like that. But instead of us all doing it separately, particularly small grants that are tiny and we don't have the funds to do lots and lots of stakeholder engagement, then that could be something that maybe the programme office could help coordinate for us and do some of that interaction to get the right stakeholders in the room with multiple projects at the same time.
Or even do it independently. Do a report, do quite a detailed report, which is then open access, and anyone can access this question. How do you engage? Yeah, it's just a lot more efficient and more transparent. It doesn't then come down to people having possibly quite good ideas but not knowing the right stakeholders. But getting those questions that Gavin was talking about defined clearly, and then everyone can, there's a wide set. People can then think about targeting relevant questions that have been identified. But again, I think something like Leicester possibly have the capacity for those. They aren't being asked to produce novel research. They have the capacity to hopefully to do multiple stakeholder engagement workshops.
And what are they, just in terms of the independent aspect, is the Leicester project's terms of engagement? Are they barred, given that they've got that, are they now barred from certain calls? Yeah.
As individuals, they can't get the money. I mean, if people don't want to do it now, if they put it on the Google Doc that I set up for this purpose, we can collate the information. And I know Heiko would be very keen to get this.
Yeah. And well, there's also there are various things that we don't need to repeat from the that we don't need to repeat now that have were presented in the talks people gave, and some of which are achievable, some of which might be achievable within this programme, some of which are much higher level, longer term issues. Right, is anything else anyone wishes to? Okay, so I guess lunch and oh.
Yeah, I wanted to. It's not related to this, but there are what about 7 or 8 people who intend to put in expression of interest. Is there any expression of interest to swap drafts and have a brief read-through? I know it's only an expression of interest, but it just popped in my mind. It has nothing to do with this, or although of course the expression of interest have to do with this. That just popped in my mind. You know, you understand what that?
Yeah. So
swap and have a quick proofread.
That's up to the 7 or 8 people.
Yeah.
to put in
Yeah.
the-
Well, because some of them are here. That's why I'm putting it in here.
Well, I was wondering, because it's tomorrow, isn't it?
Yeah, 4 o'clock.
Pete Cox was saying it's going to be very light touch, as in there's no.
Yeah, there's no.
It's not
Oh, there's no
thrown
math.
out or anything
No.
at this stage. So, should we just get them written? I mean, the main thing, if you haven't started, is that it's 4,000 character limit. For
I finished mine just now.
Yeah. But, yeah.
Just for a bit of other information on that, so it is quite light touch, and it's for administrative purposes, for NERC to get organised with a review process, and it asks you to list PI and COIs, and apparently between the EOI stage and the final submission, if you need to change COIs or add more, that is allowed. So it's just worth, if people are panicking because they haven't got the whole consortium sorted, that can be changed in this intermediate period.
But even in terms of rigor of proofreading, which doesn't seem to be there, it's just a way to exchange communication. I mean, just to exchange ideas, right? I mean, which in some sense is more interesting. So that's why I just threw it in the group.
Yeah.
Right?
So I mean, I guess that's the thing, is that because I've been talking to various people about what we're planning. I haven't actually put it on the board or the Google Docs yet. But I mean, in our case, I could. So I'm very happy to discuss, but simply because one of the key, more significant investigators than me is on holiday, I wouldn't be able to share the whole thing without checking with him. But I guess it's a case of people talking to each other and seeing what the best thing is.
Lunch.
Okay.
Lunch is the best.
Yeah.